Jerry Tello, co-founder of the National Compadres Network, Maestra Barbara Kappos, Executive Director of the East LA Women's Center, and Maestra Debra Camarillo, Executive Director of the Latino Commission. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and we are looking forward to learn new strategies from each of you.
Pues muchas gracias. Thank you all very much, and thank you for showing up and for for all of the preparation that has gone into making this possible today. I want to begin by just thanking the Creator and the ancestors and all those that have come before us, to make this possible, and that's really important, that sense of acknowledgement, because one of the things, especially in working with people, but especially in working with men, is that teaching of that you are not here alone, and you are not what you do doesn't only impact you, it impacts many, and there's many people that have come before, and in my journey, of doing this work for many years now, I've had the blessing and the pleasure of meeting many people, working with many people, and one of the blessings is working with women that have embraced us working together, and recognize the significance of us, the importance of us working for the betterment of all of our families together. And so today I have two very distinguished colleagues, leaders in the field, warriors as well, but healers. I would call them healers as well, but they're friends of mine. They're comadres. We've worked together. We've struggled together. We've cried together. We have fought together for the healing of our communities that way. So I want to just give them the opportunity to say hello to you, introduce themselves, and as we begin this presentation. And so I'll begin. Barbara, can you begin and introduce yourself? And
good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here today. I thank Jerry Tello and the National Compadres Network for the long years of friendships and collaboration. It's very nice to meet you, Debra. I've known you and heard of you many years. So it is an honor to be here. And I really thank all the participants for being here. And I am the executive director of the East Los Angeles Women's Center, and we serve the East Side communities in Los Angeles. We've been around for 46 years, a leading voice, I should say, and an advocate for survivors of families affected by sexual violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, HIV/AIDS, and of course, the intersection of homelessness. East Los Angeles Women's Center today is providing culturally responsive services that build on a foundation of trauma-informed services. And we are, designed to heal, support, and protect the communities we serve, and of course, empower those who live in our communities. And every day we fight against gender-based violence. So just a little bit about us. I will pass it on, of course, to Debra. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Maestro Jerry. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm grateful for another day of breath and life, and also to be able to share space, with two wonderful people that are out there in the community, and I give a lot of guidance and enseñanza, right? To the work that we do. My name is Debra Luis Camarillo, and I am the proud daughter of Esteban Leos Camarillo and Anita Figueroa. And I like to say that they weren't perfect parents, but they were the parents that gave me life, and that it brought me into this world with examples that I have taken forward, and also examples that I have left behind. And I say that because through them, I have learned a way to live. I'm also the director of the Latino Commission, and it's a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1991. And really it was founded because if you were a Spanish speaker and you found yourself in jail for maybe, some possession of drugs or maybe a DUI, essentially you would just have to stay in jail because there was no programs that would, that you could go to. And so with that in mind, residents here in the Bay Area, I'm in the Bay Area of San Francisco, specifically in San Mateo County, got together and we incorporated, and that's how the Latino Commission was formed, to provide services, not only to Spanish speakers, but to communities of color, right? That would offer a way that was indigenous based or culturally based, if I could say it in that way, that would provide a place that was safe and nurturing so that people could take the risk and confront the different traumas that they had experienced in their life that led to their substance use or to some of the mental health struggles that they had. So it's been really an honor and a privilege to walk with those that have been present on this journey, and also to experience, right? I have learned a lot through all of the different participants in the program, and today specifically we'll zero in with the men through the program. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Maestras, for beginning that way. I want to first of all begin by acknowledging my dad. Today I wear this hat today, right? On this webinar in honor of my father. My father, Jorge Perez Tello, who was Tapilan, Covitecan, Tejano, Mexicano out of San Antonio. And, my dad, loud talking man, so loud, hey, mijo, get here, what's the matter with you? And my friends would, hey, your dad mad. I said, that's what he talks all the time, right? My dad just a loud talking man, and sometimes we think that's lethal or potentially violent. Actually, that's what my dad was good. When he talked loud, he was good, and he wouldn't leave the house without putting a hat on. Didn't have a good hat like this, had, working hats with stains and holes, but tenía su estilo. He had his way, and he just put that hat on like that, and then I don't know, he'd lick his finger and go like, okay, let's go, okay? And it took me a lifetime, even after my dad crossed over, to realize what was under that hat, why he had to put that hat on to make himself seem bigger and stronger in this world, So I wear the hat today in honor, of my father, and not that he was, again, didn't have his flaws, didn't have his wounds, but that was my daddy, por lo buenos y lo malos, that was my father, And, in working all these years with families and communities, I think sometimes the systems try and erase, that part of I've gone in and talked with social workers, tell me about this kid, to what's going on. Well, here's his mom, but he doesn't have a dad. And I'm saying, well, that's biologically impossible, right? And I've had people say, well, I don't have a father. Well, yes, you do. You may not have been around, you may have not gotten along, you may don't even like, you may even hate him, but genetically he's in you, that way. And so, as a society, we've struggled with that. And so this presentation today is recognizing that, we all impact one another. And so we're gonna begin today, and I'm gonna just review some slides and share some slides. Those of you that were on the first two presentations will recognize these, but if not, then you can get a basis, of what is effective in working with men, and how we work together to promote healing and transformation. Let's go to the next slide. We recognize that all men want to be good men, fathers, people, and live their lives in a healthy, safe, and respectful way. I think my father did too, and he was a hardworking man, did his best, but there were days. There were days in which I know he struggled. There were days in which I remember seeing him struggle, and especially for wounded or disconnected, formerly incarcerated men, fathers, there are many challenges, and we recognize that. And but who isn't wounded, and who isn't sometimes disconnected that way, And the reality is the National Compadres Network, the way we started, the way we started is in 1988. I was already working, in the field and working a lot in issues of domestic violence and sexual assault and all of that. But there weren't services. And as Maestra Debra said, there weren't services, especially for Spanish-speaking men or men of color. They would just incarcerate us or deport us or throw us out or medicate us or keep us locked up or whatever. And so a number of us, men decided to come together to develop programming, something that was culturally appropriate, all of that. But when we came together, that time, and we were the leaders, we were the social workers, we were the lawyers, we were the advocates, we were the teachers, we were the successful men. And we came together in that initial circle. And as we began to share our conocimiento and share who we were, the second guy in that circle shared, he's a therapist and he says, but what's really going on with me is I don't know how to love my wife. I don't know how to love my kids. I don't know how to love. And he began to cry. And back in '88, that was really unusual for, us to see other men cry unless they were at a funeral or drinking or, we never saw that. And so it kind of shocked us to see this man cry and share so openly. But then he shared something very more deeper. So I'm going to say something to you, and I don't know why I'm saying this. And I don't know if but then he shared, I was sexually abused as a kid. And then he really began to cry. I mean, so much that, when somebody cries and you can hardly talk, you hear that their spirit kind of opening like that, and that's the way he cried. And when he cried like that, it touched all of us, and we all began to cry. Right? We all recognized that all of us were wounded. All of us had some disconnection, and all of us had some learning to do. And what we realized at that time, next slide, is that, that the generational learning that goes on, through our process, that, there's some lessons my daddy learned, but there's some lessons that he didn't learn. There's some wounds that my daddy carried that he never healed. He never healed, so he kind of just passed them, not because he wanted to, but that was as much as he could do. And so our childhood was filled with all those learnings. And when we think about little boys are not born violent. They're not born hateful or angry. They're not born, to be misogynistic but sometimes, living in a society that doesn't acknowledge you and doesn't respect you and doesn't even want you, you begin to, pick up certain things, and as children, we know, living that way, you're learning and you're questioning, you're wondering, you're wondering about life and wondering how to be, and I remember as a little boy, and with a lot of the men that we deal with, the ones that are wounded and come to us because they've done something, we ask them that question. So do you remember a time in which you were at peace, that you were happy? And some say they don't remember. And others say, yeah, when I was 5, before I went to school. Some mention, these different times, but they were often very young. And then they began going through life in a system, in a school system, and, the racism, discrimination, all that other stuff. The miedo, the fear, especially if you're undocumented or your parents, had issues. And so we recognize that you take that, from childhood to adolescence, and then you cope and deal with it in whatever way. And sometimes then you're in adulthood and haven't resolved all those things. But what we now recognize as well is it's not that learning doesn't begin in childhood, because we recognize now that there's those generational traumas, those generational issues. And many of us have learned those things, now that everybody's trauma informed, everybody's got to be trauma informed now, right? But what the system has not done, and what we have not recognized, is we also have generational medicine, the culturally based generation, and that's what got us through that. So when we talk about generational learning, the duality of understanding and recognizing the trauma, but also lifting up the medicine and the blessings is really, really important. Next slide. And so this becomes, the importance of answering these core questions, and if I have you reflect on, being a little boy and asking this question, am I wanted? And who am I connected to? we recognize that early on with young boys, we disconnect them from their heart. We could disconnect them. Don't be crying. What's the matter with you? Don't be a sissy. So we disconnect them right away from feelings and that sense of being interconnected or compassionate. Early on, we say, don't do that. Don't feel that. Don't sense that. You know. And so early on in this society, many times, you know, young boys are disconnected, right? As a boy, as a man, what is my role? What is my purpose in life? And again, living in a very, you know, patriarchal, misogynistic society, you begin to learn certain teachings that are not about healing, that are not about compassion, not about interconnectedness, but about being in control, about handling your stuff. You know, I remember in Compton where I grew up, it was, you know, you pretend, you ask, you know, you don't show nobody your feelings because you can get taken advantage of. On walking home from school, you got to front up. You know, and I remember at entering high school, you know, my father had already died, and I'm walking to school, the Watts riots. I lived in Compton and Watts. I remember, you know, me and my friend, African-American friend Tyrone, walking to school, and on the corner, because the riots were going on, they were burning things, there was tanks on the corner, National Guard. As we passed them by, they cocked the AK-47. And we looked and we tightened up, and I felt my body tighten up, and I, oh, dude, should we go? And we get to school, and I get to school, and I'm nervous, and my legs shaking, and it's hard for me to breathe, and I don't feel like eating, and all these repercussions physiologically that goes on. And the question becomes, where do I learn how to deal with this? Where do I heal? How do I process this? And the problem is, if you don't process it, it gets stuck. And it gets stuck in your body, it gets stuck in your ways. And then where do you go for guidance, support, and healing? And that's the problem in many of our communities. Where do you go? Right. And so, you know, that becomes the question. And next slide. But what we don't recognize is that in our culture, in the medicine, the teachings, right, that we have aspects of our culture, tradition, ways that have really helped us not only get by, but helped us survive. And so if you've ever got a blessing from your grandma, yeah, the bendición, sometimes you didn't even want it. You got to bless me again. Before I go out, I get a blessing. Before I go out, you didn't understand the significance of that, right? Well, that significance of that blessing is that you're a blessing. In spite of your wounds, in spite of your struggles, you still have dignity. You know, if you've ever have to walk in a relative's house and man, it takes you half an hour to walk in the door, right? Everybody's got to greet you. Well, that's much better than nobody seeing you, nobody wanting you, right? That feeling of nobody wanting is an ugly feeling. And when you don't feel wanted, you will hang out, you will do whatever, you will be with people even that are dangerous, that are hostile, that are just to be connected, right? And both, you know, especially Maestra Debra, who has worked with many men that, you know, substance abusing and you know, involved in violence and everything, man, you'd rather be with somebody than with nobody. And even if that means you're at high risk, right? So the question then becomes, what is our sacred purpose as men, as fathers, as boys, as partners? You know, who teaches you that, you know? And when my dad died at 13, it was like, who's going to teach me now? Well, there were guys in the corner, there were people there, but they were wounded. Who's going to teach us? You know, where do we provide that guidance, and where do you learn these cultural lessons where sometimes your own families are wounded that way? And finally, who are the safe, compassionate, secure people? You know, and I'll tell you, just as a professional myself, you know, working early on to domestic violence and sexual assault. And by the way, before the East LA Women's Center, it was called the East LA Rape Hotline, and I was the first male hired there, right? And I would go to conferences, and I'm the only male there out of 300 women. And I remember the first time I went, they kicked me out. They kicked me out because I'm a man. And even the men that are trying to be good, trying to be compassionate, trying to be responsible, we still many times will see as the perpetrators, the enemy, as we can't include them, we can't, you know. The problem with that is that the children want to see their dads. And many of the women, you know, don't want men to be incarcerated or deported. They just want them healed. You know? So where did they go? And, you know, and that's why it's so important that we have, you know, Maestras Debra and Maestra Barbara with us today, because they recognize that through their programming, through everything they recognize. Next slide. You know, the importance of that, you know. But what happens when your real life experiences interrupt your motivation to learn, grow, and develop in a healthy way. Next slide. It becomes an issue and it becomes a struggle. What happens when society doesn't see you as a blessing? Racism, because of the color of your skin or your legal status. And you don't receive the rooted teachings, and the generational trauma never gets healed. And your environment, overall life experience wounds you, poverty, inequity. And I've seen so many men that have done things just to feed their families. They rip off, they'll deal drugs, they'll do whatever just to feed their family, because there's so many processes have to go just to get a job, and you get a job and it doesn't even pay your child support. So what happens when the systems don't embrace and take into consideration, your real life experiences, and of course the school to prison pipeline. Next slide. And so we begin, really exploring, the woundedness, and how is it that we begin to work with men? Because what ends up happening is the disconnection, the insecurity, which ends up as jealousy and possessiveness and all of that, survival-based lived, and many men, especially those that have difficulty with relationship, are really scared. And I'll share a story with you, and then I'm going to open it up to Barbara and to Master Debra to share. But there was a man that I was working with. Well, he had come to me after I was doing a presentation. I was actually outside the presentation, and he came to me and he shared that he had been incarcerated for a number of years, and in fact, he was locked down in solitary confinement for about 3 years. And he says they give us about an hour on the yard every day. He says, and I would pray that, I could get through the hour. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to see the sun. I wanted to feel everything, because it's hard being inside without that. He says, but it's dangerous on the yard. He says, and it was really scary to go on that yard. So I pray, please, God, help me that and he says, we go in the yard, and he says, and finally, when I got out, I felt, oh man, I'm gonna be free, and it's good. And my greatest wish, what I prayed for, is to see my kids. I hadn't seen my kids in a long time. And I remember finally I was granted the ability to go visit my kids. He says, and talk about being scared. He says, I was scared going on the yard, but I was more scared going to see my kids. Because my greatest fear was they didn't want me. They didn't want to see me. They didn't want to be with me. He says, so I almost started using again, because that pain was so difficult. And what we see, with many, many men, and is because of this fear, because of their scared, they, often have difficulty engaging, showing up, being, and really being authentic, And so when you have that understanding of that, then there's a way in which you can be, and you can reach out in the way that you can then address those things. The next slide. And really, the susto then causes all of these things. You get confused, you withdraw, anger, because you're upset with yourself and with life. You sometimes end up blaming, and then the self-sabotaging behavior, and often the addiction. And this is where Master Debra and Master Barbara come in too, because of the work that they've done many, many years. And that's the next slide. So in spite of all the challenges, all men want to be good men, fathers, fulfill their role, but for some, they need to deal with their wounded issues of childhood before they can get to manhood. So let's go back to full screen, and I'm going to ask Barbara and Debra. Debra, you can start and just share just some reflections of what I've shared so far.
Thank you, Maestro. As I mentioned earlier, I work within the field of substance abuse and mental health, and so it's a residential and inpatient program. And I really have had the pleasure to walk with many men. And I remember when we were getting started, right, way back in the early 90s, and they would say, oh, men are the way they are because they just want to be like that. And And so it was a really interesting kind of thought, because I would think, well, who wants to be like what, first of all, right? Like when you say like that, what does that mean? But I know that our men did not want to be away from their families or struggling, trying to provide for their families, and definitely not in the situations of having to contend with going to prison or going to jail. And so when we began the work and just sitting down with men to just hear them, and to really hear the stories that they would bring forward, just like you had shared, Maestro, and the many tears, because I think there's this illusion of what men are supposed to be, that, we put a lot, especially the society, and just men of color, right? I know our Latino men, struggle because they're, trying to be the best that they can be, given the certain situations that they've all come through. And so I really just, want to acknowledge them for allowing me to be part of that process and journey with them. And for me, in that journey, I mentioned my father because I was very close to my father. And I have 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And I was always close to my father, but I also had to acknowledge that my father had a lot of trauma in his own life. And because of that trauma, he was a Tejano too, actually. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of violence and no role modeling of how do you deal with all that violence. And as a Mexicano, he was part Mexicano and part Comanche, native Comanche. What he's seen in his day and time was like the lynchings. I know we talk a lot about the African-American experience of lynchings, but there was many lynchings, especially in South Texas, of Mexicanos. And so, seeing those kind of things, where does all that go within the body, within the mind? And I just share that trauma because in substance abuse as well, it's the trauma. Substance abuse has nothing to do with the drugs. And that's what people sometimes, kind of underestimate. They think it's all about drugs. No, the drugs are a perfect avenue to deal with pain and sedating trauma and experiences that we have felt. And drugs become a great kind of solution in a way to those things. The only problem with that is it's not a permanent solution, and it's definitely not healing. And working alongside with men and walking that journey with our men, there's 2 things that kind of stick out to me. And it's part of what you said, Maestro, is that, the mother issue and then the father issue, right? They've had many studies about the men in death row. And one of the things that always comes out is like 98% of men that are on death row have been abandoned by their father. They can't relate to fathers being in their lives because the men weren't there. And so what does that do? And then the other part is for the mothers that haven't been there, right? Because they both contribute in 2 different ways. And so mothers, when a baby's born, it's that bonding and that connection that is experienced there. And that's transmitted by feelings. It's a feeling of safetyness. It's a feeling of being wanted. Just like Maestro shared, of being wanted as a person, as a baby is so important. And so when that element is not there, then where do we go? Where do we go to find that? And so sometimes we spend the rest of our lives trying to feel that, trying to feel connected, trying to look to be accepted. And, one of the things that I really tripped out on was that, a lot of people are talking about the Jeffrey Dahmer thing. It was all on the Netflix or whatever on there. And it was amazing to me at the end of all of that, of that tragic situation, this guy would kill people. And what would he do? Lay down with these people to feel connected. The lengths that we go to just to feel that part, you know, of being connected, of feeling that we belong, you know, to someone else. And so they go through that part. The other part is the father part, right? And looking at what our fathers, you know, contribute. Let me just go back a second. It's also interesting, right? When you see the sports being played, you see these big old massive athletes and their camera gets on them. And what do? You know, their time of fame, what do they do? Hi, Mom. Hi, you know, the importance. Like that's how deep it is, right? That connecting. And then going to, you know, that father part too, which provides another, you know, it's a contribution in another way, but there's so many contributions, but I just want to just zero in on that part, which is validation and affirmation that our fathers give us. And so if you see little boys play sometimes, and I'm going to finish really quick right here. You see the young boys playing out there, right? And they're like, oh man, my dad could beat up your dad, or my dad knows more. You're like this competition, right? It's a natural thing because the little boys are seeing that role is so important, right? And so when you think about that, oh man, you know, my dad's stronger than your dad. Well, when that strong dad, you know, that's so powerful, or that all-knowing dad, you know, that's so like huge, and they say, oh, mijo, I'm so proud of you. Oh, good job. Imagine what that does to that young man, to that boy. Being affirmed by that which you think is so out of this world. But then the contrary, when that's not there, when you don't have that significant role model of manhood that endorses you, then what does that also do, right? And so if it contributes that, you know, when your father's a good boy, or that was a good job, or what, when that happens, you're feeling like, wow, I'm feeling good. Like I am somebody. Like I do have meaning. I have a purpose, you know, like I matter. Well, when that's absent, then it's really easy for our young men to then think, you know what? I do not matter. Nobody does care for me. Like I don't have no value. You know, I'm not worthy. And so if none of that matters, then hey, life doesn't matter. So then who cares? So then it's so easy then to make the next move, which is then we harm each other and we harm others, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because I don't matter. And so I'm going to leave it at there, and I'm going to pass it over.
Yeah, you know, that's a beautiful, Maestra, because, you know, it really talks about the significance of acknowledging and welcoming and connecting. You know, and your story, it kind of reminds me of a situation where I was seeing this young man. He was probably around, I don't know, he must have been 22 or something. He was already a father. But he was reported because of, you know, substance abuse and gang violence, everything, and you know, mandated to see me. And so I was seeing him in a session, and when we finished, he says, so Mr. Tello, can you give me a ride home? I said, no, I'll give you a bus pass, and, you know, the bus. But he said, man, I can't take a bus. It's going to ride through these two neighborhoods, and, you know, this good dude's going to get me. I said, okay, I'll give you a bus, a taxi voucher. I said, well, I can't ride to my house in a taxi. Just give me a ride. I know you're going that way. You go that way anyway. That's where you live. I know you go that way. Why don't you just give me a ride? And I said, well, I would, but the policies in our organization says we can't transport clients. It's a liability for the organization. And he sits back and he looks at me. He says, well, you know what? In my neighborhood, you know, the policy said I shouldn't be here. And it's a liability for me. So what's up? You can give me a ride? And I'm like, oh, dude, this dude caught me, you know? And I had a dilemma. because, and then he said, and then I said, well, okay, meet me behind the alley behind my car. I'll give you a ride, but don't tell nobody, right? And so I was going against the policies, because the policies sometimes interrupt what we need to do. As I was driving this young man home, you know, we're sitting there and talking just a little bit, but not a lot. And he was one that really didn't share a lot. He showed up for the session, but really didn't share a lot. And as we were walking down there, I looked at him and he was crying. I said, "Migo, what's the matter?" He says, "You know, when I grew up, I always saw these boys driving with their dads. And I wondered what that felt like, because my dad died when I was 2. I just wanted to ride with my dad, you know, and I never got a chance to do that. And I always get jealous, and then it make me mad. And then I don't want nobody to know, so then I'd fight." And he says, "But now I know what that feels like." He says, "Mr. Tello, I know you weren't supposed to do this, but thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate it." You know, and he started to cry. And that opened him up, where things then shifted, you know, from then on, and we began on a healing path with him. But I had to show him, yes, I'm even willing to go beyond the policy, you know, to give you what you need. And it brings me then to Barbara, because, you know, the way I met Barbara was, you know, she had the insight of knowing that, you know, young men needed guidance, and young men, you know, needed all of these things. And maybe, Barbara, you can share with us how we met, how you started your work in that way.
There's a lot to reflect on here, both from Debra and from you, Jerry, and really imagining that was about 25 years ago, maybe even over.
Yeah.
And we're still talking about the same issues, which is discouraging, but at least we're still talking and we're here. And I met Jerry, I was at another agency at that time at Bienvenidos, and we had the opportunity to conduct a fatherhood parenting group. And I thought, what do we know about parenting for fathers? I mean, our parenting is really not focused on men. So I invited Jerry, and he came, and, you know, always humble and caring. And, you know, I love you, Jerry, because your compassion and your commitment to not only the men and women and children to this community, but overall, you know, you're a huge heart. And that means a lot always to me. So we got together, and it looked like you agreed. You said, yes, sure, let's do it. And then you left. And then you were part of my life and the part of the organization's life for many, many years to come. But one of the things we were able to establish was a parenting program for young teen fathers called Con los Padres. And these were young teen fathers. We had a collaboration with the district attorney's office at that time, who managed the child support services. And these were young men, many of them gang affiliated, didn't really know how to be a father. They have many of the issues that, you know, you both have just discussed, but they wanted to know their kids. And, you know, they were 16, 17 years old. Some were even a little bit younger. And many times they would show up in group, and they were from different gangs, and they would put that aside and sit in that circle as young fathers. And then we had our, you know, 3 facilitators, Bobby Verdugo, and Ricky Lopez, and Rigo, and God bless Bobby, who's no longer with us, bless his soul, along with Jerry and the whole National Compadres Network, who really stood behind this group. And, you know, it still is very powerful for me to remember. Sorry, I can hear her. So it was very powerful to hear their stories and to see these men make those connections, as you talked about, Debra, with their children, be able to have visits and possibly relationships with their children, because the reality is that, you know, society would look at these young teen men and say, well, they're gang affiliated, they don't have any income, They're, not safe to be with their children. Many of them had to be monitored visits. But through this circle, through this project, we saw young men not only get connected to their children, but begin a whole new life. And that was really the grounding for me to know that it's essential that we really change the way we do things. And now that I'm with the East Los Angeles Women's Center, I've been with the East Los Angeles Women's Center for about 15 years now. This is an agency that serves survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence. And of course, I have to say that when a survivor comes in, her safety and her children's safety is critical. That is the essential thing that we work with. And sometimes they're not safe, and we have to help them get to a place of safety. But in saying that, I have to say that most of the survivors that come in want their children to have a relationship with their father. And so that led us again to, really reconnect with Jerry. I mean, we never disconnected, but we wanted to establish groups at our agency to provide the circle for men. And I say men because most of the gender, we're open to all genders, but the majority of the survivors that come into our agency are women. And I would say 70% are immigrant women and have experienced multiple traumas. So when they come in to our agency, they are, seeking support to become empowered and to become, move from being a victim to survivor. And so that is much of our focus. But, there are so many stories where they want their partners or their, the fathers of their children to be connected to their children, and the children want to be connected. The other day, we had a case where the mom is separated from the father, and they have a lot of issues, but the young boy, he's about 11 years old, he told his mom, and he told the therapist that works at our organization, I want to talk to my dad, but I want to think about what I want to say, but I want that opportunity to talk to him. And that was hard for the mom. She was afraid for a lot of different reasons, but we explained to her how essential it was, and we could, provide this in a safe place so that this child can begin to talk about his real feelings. And because he's in therapy, he really felt like he needed to tell his father how he felt and include him in his life. So we're able to do that and try to talk to the mom and support her. So, at this point now, where we're at as an organization, we have a variety of groups that are for men, and they're led by this collaboration we have with the National Compadres Network. I think it's essential to have these types of collaborations because we learn from one another. The DV field and the sexual assault field is not really open to working with men, I would say. I'm not saying that is true with all organizations, but this is evident by the funding. The funding does not permit, when you're working with survivors, to be also inclusive of men. So there you go. I mean, it really sets the stage of how we work with men. I remember, and I don't know if you remember this, Jerry, but years back, we had submitted a proposal to CalWorks, which basically works with survivors. And because of my relationship with Jerry and the National Compadres Network, I wrote in that we would also be working with men in a safe environment and all of this. And they called me and told me, well, you scored the highest, however, we're not going to fund you unless you take out the part working with men. And that was really, shocking. I had to take it out, but then we found other funding to be able to support the services that we were going to provide. So, you have to be creative, and you have to find ways of really filling this gap And I think, we have done that as best as we can, but, there has to be a change on that level, on the funding level, and really accepting that men have to be partners with women in order to end gender-based violence. This is the only way. Women alone cannot do this. I do believe that. Maybe some will not agree with me, but there's no other way of really ending violence against women without partnering with men. So at this point now, we have a fatherhood class and a healing group, and we have a group that includes men who've caused harm. And there's a huge network that the National Compadres Network puts together, and they meet once a month. And these are men from the community from all walks of life that are businessmen and activists, but also professionals. And inclusive are some of the men that have, gone to the group, so that there's this huge support from one another, and that that network has strength through mentorship and support. So, I just have to emphasize how important it is to have men, working with women to end violence. I raised a young son myself, and he told me a story one time that he was at a party, and that this girl was very drunk, and she sat next to him, and she put her head on his shoulder. And he said, Mom, I had to, make sure she was safe, that she got home safe. And, he told me what he did. And I cried because I thought, this is, I know we talk about men raising men, but women raise young boys. And, when your young boy says something like that to you, he's on the right path, and that he can help other men to understand how important their role is in helping women be safe, and really being, a positive part of this life.
Well, thank you, Barbara, for that. And you have raised a wonderful young man, and a lot of others, because through your advocacy and leadership, have really broken cycles, for so many young men, and one of them, was on the presentation, the last couple of presentations, Ozzie Cruz. He was one of those teen fathers that that came in and didn't want to go away, so we had to hire him, because he kept coming in and eating the pizza and wanted to attend the class and go to the next round and all of that.
And he still works with us, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I have to tell him he was 16 years old when I met him, and now he's, I don't know, 40 something, whatever. Yeah.
But it takes, and here's the reality, and I've always acknowledged this, is that any healing movement, any aspect of true healing in our communities has been led by women, has been led by women, and women, because women, for the most part, really know that aspect of compassion and love and all of that, and have been, allowed a little bit more than us men to be able to feel that and at least stay connected to that. But at the same time, as you mentioned, women can also create barriers, can say, no, we don't want them around, and we've seen that over the years, and there was nationally a lot of battles that went on, and it was the women of color that really stood up, to the national movement that says, no, we need our men. We just want them healed, and they have to be accountable, but we need them healed as well, And I think that's that's a significant work that both of you have done, But I know there are challenges. There are challenges in working in a system that also often just categorizes men as perpetrators. But and I was wondering if Debra, because I know, Maestra, that not only do you work with the Latino Commission, but you also work with ODAS as well in guiding the women and girls work. But even in that, even in that women and girls work that you're working with, with women and rites of passage with young girls and all of that, you insist the connection to the men and the masculine as well. As what are the challenges in approaching this, from a personal standpoint, from a relationship standpoint, but systemic, that you've seen, and what have you all been able to do, at Latino Commission and in all the other work that you've done to really kind of circumvent that and deal with that in a good way?
Sure. Thank you, Maestro. Let me just start by using some of your words. I've been in circles with you and in other situations where you say this, Maestro. You say, I teach men to take less space and women to take more space. And I think that really is such a beautiful vision of the way that, at least for myself, the way that I look at it. And I think that the challenge is that we have a society that's a patriarchal society. And so it's very difficult to bring balance when you come from a patriarchal standpoint, right? Because bringing in balance would mean that then we would give as much time for the heart and the spirit instead of just the intellectual and the physical. And so when we look at it in that way, and especially working with our young women, it's important to acknowledge that the gifts that they bring as young women, first of all, is so necessary in fortifying this next generation, right? So their voice is so important, but that voice really has to have that sense of healing and that sense of balance, so that what doesn't happen is that someone that has been traumatized or experienced traumas or negative experiences doesn't then come out and then be the perpetrator of those types of experiences. And it's just like what Paulo Freire says, an oppressed people given power will then oppress other people. And so that's where the healing part, that healing informed part, is so imperative, right? That we come from that place. Because it's just like, if you have an empty pitcher, you can't fill up somebody's glass of water. So it's not until we experience that healing for ourselves. So in working with young women, we talk about that sacredness and that and the essence of who they are, which is a treasure. That sacredness that they bring into it. And so if I look at myself as sacred, then the interactions that I have then have to be conducted in that way, in the way of sacredness. So I'm not going to, accept unsacred treatment. Like also, I'm not going to give unsacred treatment because of who I am and that alignment, right? Also with men, working with men, it's that, it's because of the healing that's necessary in their lives is why they don't give sacred treatment, right? Because it's out of the woundedness that they then have their behaviors. And so then part of that healing that happens within their lives then allows them, gives room for them to then treat others in a sacred way, because they're beginning with themselves and treating themselves in a sacred way. So as we, but also the acknowledgement that we both have to walk together. It's just like what Barbara said. It's great that our women have places to go, like, to place of domestic violence resources and things like that. But if they can't walk together with the men, then how are we really bringing solution to this area? Or not? Because as well as I do, and that's the part where we get perplexed, right? Oh my gosh, she was in a bad relationship, left him, and now is with someone else. That's the same person, just a different name. Well, she needs a healing, but so does he, because he will then do the same thing he will go and victimize someone else. And so coming from that perspective of healing and really starting with ourselves, whoever that might be, if it's young women, if it's young men, we have to first start with ourselves, that healing. And so when we deal with our men that, let's say, have had their relationships with their mothers that have been, you know, not a very good relationships, then what we say is, okay, so then can you find a grandmother? Can you find another woman that is healthy, that can te puede dar cariño in a good way? Find those women so that you can then get that affirmation or that love, that cariño that you didn't get, but you still have an opportunity to get. So how do we get those surrogate mothers? And for mujeres that are out there that have that, like our grandmothers, we need our grandmas, healthy grandmas there to then bring that love to our men. That's not sexualized, that's not exploitive, you know, that's not violent, but in a healthy way that can go, oh, you know what? Oh, you did a great job there. Oh, and then can give him, you know, can hug him in a good way if he's ready for that.
Wow.
The other part is for our young women too, right? Where are our good grandpas and our good fathers that can give that, not exploitive love, but then could just acknowledge her in a good way. So it's really traveling together in that way.
Yeah. You know, thank you, Maestra. And you know, and as you're speaking, I want to acknowledge my compañera Susana, because, you know, anybody that knows her knows that she is, you know, heart, she's cariño, she's love. And there's so many young men that you know, really want to be connected to her, because she's like this grandmother love, you know, and they need that. They need that sense of just unconditional acknowledgement by the female spirit as well, you know. And I, you know, and that the sense, that first teaching of acknowledgement in You're Wanted is so powerful that, you know, Ozzy talks about this, you know. He talks about when he went to the first Con los Padres class, which he didn't want to go to. His PO sent him, and he went because he had to go. But then, you know, Bobby Verdugo, as he saw him, he says, Mico, welcome. And he talks about that's the first time any man had ever called him Mico. They called him my son. And at first it was like, well, who's called me that? Well, you're not my dad. But then we kept doing it, and all the men called the young men Mico, you know. And he says, and then it opened up something in me that was missing. And I went back because that felt good. I know I needed that, right? And what that brings in is the cultural aspect. You know, that in our culture, it's not just about the nuclear family. That's why we have extended family. Because sometimes your dad is so wounded that he can't guide you in a good way. You may need another uncle or another tío or a grandpa. And sometimes your mom, you know, my mom wasn't very affectionate. You know, she wasn't real loving, and I had difficulty with that, you know. And later on, I began to understand why she wasn't. She went through her own journey. But that's the other thing is that you mentioned, is that there's many young men that have not gotten that love, even from the mothers. You know, so they long for that so much. They don't know what it really is, and they long for it, and search it out wherever. And so, and that's where even in our experience, some of the indiscriminate sexual behavior comes, because they really want to be connected, but they don't know how to get connected. So the only thing, well, let's have sex. And then, you know, but really what they're wanting is someone to hold them or nurture them. And these are the kind of discussions that we're able to have when we sit together. We're able to have these teachings and these discussions. We're able to share with men and even counsel men and even make them accountable. Because sometimes in those circles, men will share some things. Well, I had to tell my son, you know, this, and this. And I said, well, and did that help your son? Did that help your relationship? Well, he's just got to learn. No. Do you think that was helpful to him? Do you think that was nurturing to him? Well, that's the only way I know how to do it. Okay, that's a different question. That's the only way I know how to do it. But do you think that's good for your relationship and what you want your son to be? And you see that in these circles where we can be open, when there's confianza, when there's trust, that becomes then the alternative way. You know, that we do need extended kinship. We do need other people to guide us, you know, and help us on both ends, you know. And the aspect of you know, men and women working together, and even all those on that gender spectrum as well, because you know, it's not just men and women, it's all those on that gender spectrum that have issues. You know, some of us are more masculine and some of us are more feminine, you know. But you know, really, you know, it becomes important, you know, for us to be able to work through this, you know. And I'm thinking, Barbara, you know, in the organization in East LA Women's Center, you know, I know you've had to intentionally do some work to be able to open this up to the organization, you know, to be able to work with women that would be open to saying, okay, I guess we need to, you know, because not all women are at that place, you know, because of their own experiences and their own, you know, what has gone on with them as well. To be able, what are the challenges of doing that, of shifting that? How do we do that? How do organizations shift from just being female-centered, even though the men are there, and being more inclusive of men in a good way? Of course, after you protect for, you know, safety and accountability. How does that happen? How have you been able to do that?
Okay, it's a big question.
Yeah.
Well, you know, first of all, that is their choice. If this is, you know, something they're willing to open up to. But I will tell you that most of the men that are referred to the groups are referred by women, by their partners, or by the mothers of their children. And it's more difficult. And you know, if Luis was on here, he would say it's difficult to do outreach because a lot of men do not come forward. They don't want to admit they want help. They don't want to admit that they need support. I mean, I actually had someone tell me a while back, and I'll never forget this. He said, it's better to be known as a perpetrator than a survivor, than a victim, actually, than a victim. I would rather be known as a perpetrator than a victim.
Wow.
What does that say about our society, right? So, you know, it's been, like I said, I'm there almost 15 years now. And when I first went, you know, there weren't services for men there because of, again, it's the field that, you know, a lot of organizations do not work with men. And, you know, I'm hoping that that changes. But we started out by providing these groups and by really establishing, you know, reestablishing the collaboration with the National Compadres Network. You know, having that union is essential. And, you know, there's not a lot of research that indicates the effectiveness of working with men, to be honest with you. If you look at the research, it's not there. But what is out there is that, you know, small groups led by men. I mean, that's one thing that, you know, the research does say that men working with men is more effective. It's almost like the example that you just gave, that within that group, that there's no judgment, there's no shame, but there's also somewhat of accountability that, you know, you brought up when you talked about this man, how he was raising his son and how, you know, the approach he was using, that within a non-judgmental environment, you could address those issues. And I think that that is effective. You know, men can prevent violence against women by not personally engaging in violence, but also by intervening against violence of other men and by addressing the root causes of violence, which is what, you know, we've been talking about, right? And I think that it's essential that it's not discussed among us professionals, those in the field, but that we have these discussions with, you know, everyday fathers, people who come into the organization. I'll give you a little funny story, you know, through this, you know, we have a promotora that works with us, and she, you know, she finished the training and she goes out in the community and she does a lot of outreach on domestic violence, sexual violence, and she's really, you know, amazing, right? So one day we we get a visit from her husband. He comes to the agency and he wants to talk with us. I'm like, okay. And so he said, I want to know what my wife is doing here. And we said, okay. So she's in this training. We explained to him, and she said it was okay to talk to him, right? Because she's not in a in a program. She's doing promotora work, right? So he says, well, I want you to know that there's been changes about her, and I don't like it. She's supposed to cook dinner for us every night. I have 4 children, and she's walking around with her head up, and she doesn't laugh at my jokes anymore. So he was very upset about all this, and because she has changed, she evolved, and he really wasn't part of that change. He could just see that there was a difference in her. So we sat down with him and explained to him what we do and why we're here, and how her part is essential because she is the bridge to the community. She's out there touching the lives of many. And I can tell you today, he takes our cards, especially around sexual violence, and he passes them around, and he's a partner. Okay. So he came in not very happy, but he left understanding, and he becomes a partner of this agency and this movement. So that's why it's critical that as organizations that, we kind of break the isolation, we open up ourselves to discuss these issues and include men in our work. And I'm repeating this over and over again because, many organizations struggle with this. And again, I will say safety is critical, but there's a way of doing this that can be inclusive and can break this isolation and make those connections Debra was talking about. Connections are essential to being effective with men and families and children.
The beautiful example, Barbara, because I've experienced that throughout the years, that even at schools, I do parenting, and mostly women show up and they begin doing parenting and changing parenting styles and ways of raising kids and leadership development. And then the women go home and what are you doing? Yes, it's cambiando, and nothing's going on with the men, But when you begin including men in the process too, and they begin to walk parallel, then something happens. Something really magical happens, and there's this whole aspect of that I want to just address. We've addressed it in the last couple of webinars about machismo, right? And a lot of people have this false sense of what machismo is. The true essence from the indigenous aspect, really there's 12 principles. And the first principle is honoring women. The second being a person of your palabra, being a person of your word, being compassionate, sensitive, responsible, all of these things. But what has happened through oppression and through colonization is that turned to a wounded sense of machismo, which then is patriarchy and misogynistic and being controlling and all of those things. That's the wounded sense, right? And so when we work with men, we differentiate. What man do you want to be? What man do you think your kids need you to be? What man do you think your partner needs for you? And if you want to be this one, then come and we will help you water that. But we will also help you heal those wounds of the false woundedness as well. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of programs and not a lot of openness, to this, and so you end up, then with the alternative of what Debra deals with, men that are using substances, and the base of even the substances sometimes is their own abuse or sexual abuse or own violence has happened to that. Can you speak to that a little bit, Debra, just in terms of what you all do, to really bring healing to men that way?
Sure. Yeah, and before I go there, I just wanted to kind of piggyback of what Barbara had said about the research. It's really interesting to me, because the research funding follows the research, right? And so if there's no research, then there's no funding. And it's just so interesting to me that I know there's that saying that says misery is profitable. When you look at the research and the money that's invested into healing methodology, then the funding comes really, really small, and that inclusiveness. And so I just want to challenge everyone listening out there, and that, to make some noise around the areas of healing. let's look at funding and having a voice for funding that is not always negative based or trauma based, but healing informed. You know, I know there's just a dearth of funding when it comes to these types of programs, but we also know that they do work. You know, they do work, and we engage in things that are, you know, they're hundreds of years old. And if we want to say evidence-based, or you can't get more evidence-based than hundreds of years, you know, and that's when we do come into the circles. And we work with our men, and first of all, just coming and sitting together, you know, giving our men a lugar, giving them a place to say, look, at you matter. You know, you are somebody just being here. There's nothing else that you need to be, but just being here is amazing. And this is an opportunity to really go towards those things that you really want to do. Because I can tell you, you know, we hear a lot about our, you know, the sexual abuse with women. It's as much with our men as it is with our women. The only thing is that men are taught not to say anything about it. We have our women that abuse our men, but it's not okay to talk about those things. But our men are faced with a lot of those traumas as well. And so looking at bringing down the mask, giving our men permission to really be human and to go that things have hurt their heart, have destroyed their spirit, and acknowledging that and saying, you know, of course, we, you know, the natural thing to do is to be defensive, is to pretend these, no, because I'm supposed to be this, you know, this. The unnatural thing that is not endorsed by the society is to say, you know what, I've been wounded. It's had an impact on me. And you know what, I would really want to do something about it. And give place, give opportunity, save places for our men to come together with each other and share these things and to get it out. And also giving them the opportunity to make amends in a good way, to give that road back, you know, towards forgiveness, give that road back for acknowledgement of the things that they have done that they maybe didn't want to do, and honoring that process, you know, and not just keeping them in this perpetual as perpetrators, as perpetrators, and keeping a box there and not giving in any options to get out of that. And so I you know, I would just offer that.
Yeah. Thank you, Maestra. You know, and you know, with that, you know, again, I think that healing path, you know, then allows us to change the narrative. Because some people say, well, men don't express their feelings, men don't cry. And I said, you really? I said, in the last 30 years, I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands. I said, well, Mexicano men, what? All I got to do is bring them in a circle, begin in a good way, and se sale todo. I mean, so we need to break even the stereotypes that we have. Because if you create the safe environment, you create, you know, the sacred space, you create a process, the healing will happen and the tears will come. And you know, and let me be clear as we you know, end this part, is that, you know, of course, as Barbara's mentioned and Master Debra's mentioned too, you know, safety is the priority. Accountability. This doesn't mean you don't make people accountable. It doesn't mean that you don't, you know, you don't, that, of course, that's a given. But after that, then we must go on this healing path, because if not, it'll be passed on to generations, you know, that way. So I want to leave some space to see if there's any questions that people have posed, or anything that people would like to ask, and that we have a few minutes to answer.
We do have a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to go in order. The first question that we have is, what about the ones who don't want to be? Mr. Tello's slide, it says that all men want to be good. That is not true. Yes, there are challenges, but sometimes an adult is a psychopath.
Yeah, well, I think you know, the comment is that their spirit is still sacred. They may be wounded so deep that their behaviors and their reactions, you know, don't function that way. but it deepened their spirit. I mean, any one of us that have done anything that has harmed somebody else, inside of us, we really didn't want to do that. It was a reaction to our pain, to our woundedness. And for some people that, you know, when we talk about, you mentioned psychopath, right? Mentioned that term. What we talk about in our indigenous sense is sometimes when you carry like 3 or 4 generations of pain, you know, it devastates you so deeply that all you do is react as, you know, as a way of protecting yourself. And sometimes that's harmful all the time. In our communities, there was a place for folks like that too. And even in Compton, you see, you know, that we call the loco, you know, the guy over there, you don't put children around him, you don't go around him. It was already, hey, everybody knew, you know, you don't allow anybody to be around him, right? But we still fed him. They still took him comida. They still, you know, so it's an acknowledgement that's, we have to acknowledge after 500 years of trauma and oppression, there's a whole group of our folks that are heavily traumatized, that they, you know, they don't have a connection to heart, to spirit, right? So definitely that is taken into consideration, but it doesn't mean they still don't want to be good at the deepest sense of their spirit, right? There's deepest sense, right? And so you know, you address programming depending on where they're at, and again, the safety and accountability.
Maestro, can I just add that, you know, I don't know what baby is born that says, you know what, I just want to be a drug addict. And my goal in life is to, you know, harm everybody. You know, it's all this other madness that life brings, unfortunately, that creates a lot of this, you know, and that wounds the spirit. And just like any wounded spirit, it's like if you get an animal that's wounded and you try to get close to that animal, they're going to be defensive. And so, you know, I think that when we talk about healing, vicarious healing, that I think we don't talk so much about, is so important, because just like we have vicarious trauma, we also have vicarious healing. And as you heal, and as I heal, you will heal. And we will change our environments and our homes and our communities. But it starts with us. We have to begin in that process, and always be having an extension or a bridge that will allow those that are wounded, if they want to come back, if they want that healing, here's a path that's offered for them.
And I wanted to add, and I wrote that down, vicarious healing, because that is powerful. So I understand her question, working with survivors and being fearful of their life when they enter our doors and they're fleeing and we need to put them in a shelter. We get that 100%. And our first priority is making sure that that survivor or victim and her children are safe. However, understanding the root causes is a whole other issue. You know, so it's so essential that we're having these conversations, because then vicarious healing can happen. Maybe not right away, maybe later on in years, maybe not for this person, but for someone else. This, especially in my field, in the DV, sexual assault field, we do have to embrace this and understand the root causes in order to really end gender-based violence, in order to raise our young men. I think that there's 2 different scenarios here, is keeping someone safe and then understanding the root causes and what we can do to prevent further harm and further destruction of what is going on in our society. You know, I meet every day, you know, these men who are on the streets, who've been homeless for years. And, you know, we've heard about a lot of incidents of violence, and you wonder why, because they've been on the streets, they have been disconnected, they are isolated. And the only thing that they really know what to do right now is harm, because they're angry. How could we have prevented this from happening? So, you know, it's a lot to take on, but it is our problem, and we do need to face it. That's all I have to say.
Well, yeah, and especially when we're seeing, extensive homelessness and, I've worked with veterans, got PTSD for years. And, and the fear that is so devastating, you just react to stuff, to anything, noise, to anything, understanding that we contributed to that. As a society, we've contributed to not healing those people that have we put in harm's way to protect us in that way. So next question, yeah.
This next question is for Barbara. You mentioned research that stated that men working with other men is more effective, and I believe in small groups. What is that research? Could you provide it? I'm interested in digging into that.
I will send the link to you, and it's through the Office of Violence Against Women, that research. So I will send you the link.
Thank you.
Let me just mention something about that, because it is our work has been often men working with men, but let me just say that at some point it's also very powerful for women to work with men, and for men and women to work together, right? Because that becomes then the bridge. Many of these women, as Master Debra has mentioned, have unresolved issues with their mothers, and because of that, they then transfer that to women. And so now you have a co-facilitation of men and women, not in the first stage, but as part of the healing too, in which then, they can then begin to look at the world, from the other side, and begin to resolve some of those issues. So there's different stages of the healing that need to go on, and it's something that collaboratively all of us together are doing, something we provide training on and insight into, and developing programming for as well. Okay.
The next question says, Hola, my name is Jackie, and I am working with a domestic violence and sexual assault community advocacy organization called Voces Unidas for Justice in Colorado Springs. We are all mourning the tragic shooting at our LGBTQ+ club the night before last. This morning, we had a plática about many things, but also in recognizing the woundedness of the young man who committed this crime, and how he had initially targeted his mother in this violence. Although most men who commit mass shootings like this are white, we are still looking for ways to build this kind of violence prevention into our general youth violence prevention programming as a way to help our community heal now and in the future. Do you have any insights or guidance on how we can understand and address that kind of wounding in our community of men?
So, we have a Joven Noble program for young men. There's the Girasol, the Master Debra and Master Susie guide for the women. The younger you start, the better. The more, because in working with young people in their development, when you begin then to give them a space to address their generational wounds, but also begin to rebalance the sense of how do you deal with hurt? How do you deal with harm? How do you deal with these feelings? But also, how do you develop a voice and a process for healing? Then we have a better opportunity and a better chance, to really address this. I think the link to the National Compadres Network is there, that people can reach out as well. Yeah, Maestra Debra.
Can I add too? It's really the honoring of humanity. So it's really giving lugar and understanding that there's a fluidity from the male to the female, that those energies, and giving that the respect and the honoring and acknowledgement that we're all sacred wherever we identify on that spectrum, I think is so important too, as we go forward, right, and bringing in the healing for all of our communities.
If we can finish by going back to the slides, I want to let's go to the next slide, and we'll close out with some of these slides. The benefits of all of this is the ability to break cycles of disconnection, to heal generations of pain, to rebuild valued traditions, and to recover the sacredness as men. I mean, that's what we're all trying to do. Next slide. In this process, transformational engagement and healing is something we call la cultura cura. Next slide. We come back to these rooted teachings. How do we build relationships and programs that honor these four values of creating a space where people are welcome and seen as a blessing, and creating dignity, that they have a sacred purpose in their, whatever their role is in their family and their community, and we respect that. That we bring in the cultural teachings, rites of passage that can bring trust in themselves, their own intuitive sense, but in someone else. We all need somebody else. and that they have a safe, compassionate, secure place and people. And we do it with love, we do it with compassion that way. Next slide. How do we engage men and other identified males in the path to positive learning, healing, development, accountability? Next slide. First is, sacred manhood, living their lives in such a way to honor all our relations. That's the goal. It allows them to recover, uncover, discover their sacred self, fulfill their sacred purpose, heal the generational wounds, and then pass on the medicine and teaching to the next generation. And that's really important for men to understand that what you do will be passed on. So we want to pass on the healing part. Next slide. That organizations' roles, policies, training, staffing, and programming that supports boys, men's fathers to a process to build on that wisdom, heal generational wounds, learn society's teachings while preparing them for life's challenge so they can fulfill their sacred purpose. The models we have out there and the funding that is not adequate. In fact, sometimes it's very oppressive and very racist, and we need to change those things. Next slide. Systems need to develop policies and procedures that support male fatherhood involvement. Barbara pointed to that in terms of the lack of funding, fund and support culturally based, trauma-informed, healing-centered efforts, right? Next slide. So how do we transform the narrative of wounded, formerly incarcerated, disconnected fathers and boys? Must include, next slide. It's a whole process. And here's the 4-step process that, you can, check out, and if you go to any of our trainings, we'll talk about this 4 stage. And the first stage is acknowledgement. We're barely there in working with men. Can we just acknowledge that men need to be healed? If you can't get there, you can't get to the other stages, right? But that's where the first stage is. That's acknowledge that men are necessary, important, just as women and just as all people in the gender spectrum are important. We have to acknowledge, begin an understanding so we can integrate into our way of working with them a process and make a commitment to healing for all. Next slide. So that acknowledgement means the message is you're wanted and valued in spite of your woundedness, in spite of your past life challenges. And what we need to do is training for staff on unconscious bias, cultural issues, and then positive male involvement. That brings dignity. Next slide. Sense of acceptance, right? The message is your life challenges and blessings are teachings that can help you fulfill your sacred purpose. No hay mal que por bien no venga, right? And we must provide services and programming that are father, male, sensitive, and realistic to their reality, what they're going through. Respect that in that way. Next slide. The compassion, we're here to support in every way and remind you of your authentic cultural teachings. Many people have false cultural teachings, have oppressive and colonized ways. We must transform those. So develop culturally based healing-centered services with love that are based on the true teachings. Next slide. And finally, give fathers, young men a voice to co-create their journey and a safe place to grow, heal, and give back. Systemic racial equity and racial healing. We must make a commitment to that because society definitely is pushing us the other way. Next slide. Here are some of the services we offer. We have fatherhood programs, curriculum, rites of passage, mentorship circles, organizational development as well. Next slide. And, we point to our, one more before, that one. The Healing Generations podcast that you guys can listen to. We have over 120 podcasts, some that are focused on elders. Maestra Debra, Maestra Susie do a whole podcast for mujeres. We have a elders one for young people and for young people as well. If you'd like to check out my book, Recovering Your Sacredness, and the last slide, you can go to the link, all that's there. And then if you need information, it's right there. Let's go back to full screen. Last words, to give Maestra Debra and Maestra Barbara last words as we close. Maestra Debra.
I'll just end with this. My father, when I was born, was a totally different man when my youngest sister was born. And to me, that is the opportunity that every man out there has. That if you truly, truly want change, you can reach change. You can reach healing. It's available to anyone that wants it. And thank you. It's been a blessing to be here with everyone. Barbara, a pleasure to sit here with you. Thank you, Maestro, for the invitation, and bendiciones to everyone out there.
Barbara. You're on mute.
I finally did that, okay. Such an honor to be with you, Debra, and of course, Jerry. I just want to thank everyone that has been on this path. Hopefully, this path will get shorter and that we will be able to reach this really understanding of how important it is that we all work together to end violence in our communities. I also want to thank the men that are at our center, Ozzy, Armando, Luis, for the incredible work that they do working with men. And I'm humbled to be here today. And I wish everyone peace and mostly love. We have to love one another.
Thank you all, and again, I want to just acknowledge the women who have always led us, waited for us, been patient with us, and helped us heal. Barbara and Master Debra and my compañera Susana, my mother, and all the women, my daughters and granddaughters, just that's why I've been able to be on this healing path, because so many women have embraced and guided us that way. Thank you all for joining us today. And, and for the Latinos United for Peace and Equity, thank you very much.